Okay, so now that we know what points and prims are, let's talk about how we can manipulate them and move them around in our scene. So I'm going to just hop over here. I'm going to throw down a grid. And then I'm going to dive inside. Let's frame this up. And let's get out our selection tool. So when I click this selection tool, you can see across the top we get a toolbar. I can select points. Oh, and it's asking me to save my file. Just one sec. So I can grab my selection tool over here, and then you can see across the top, this menu appears with a bunch of different options. If I select this first one, I can select points, and if I grab a bunch of points like this, select my move tool and move them, you can see I've effectively moved my points. And what has it done over here? It's created an edit SOP for us. That's kind of weird. I didn't really tell it to do that. But when you think about the procedural nature of Houdini, it needs an instruction in its node editor to be able to determine what the geometry is actually doing. So it actually needs to have this instruction in here to be able to determine that we're going to move these points. Now, moving points like this is sort of more of a traditional modeling type of a behavior, as opposed to procedural modeling. Now, over here, when we were to move these points and then have this node be created automatically for us, you can see up here in the parameters that this node is actually selecting groups of points for us. So if I turn on these point numbers, you can see it looks like it's selected points 74, 64, 65. You can see that's what, those are some of the numbers from the end of this list. Really what it has done is it's determined what we grabbed, put it into a list, and then created the instruction to move it up by 0.78 like we did just here. In the same way, this also works for primitives. Now, if I were to go back to my selection tool and select the primitive selection mode and grab, say, this primitive, and then hit my move tool and move it up, it is now moving this face up by 0.82. But we only have one edit node here, and it looks like our groups have changed. So what exactly happened to our stuff? Well, basically, what happens is when you're manipulating geometry like this, a lot of times what can happen is there's going to be a non-procedural sort of edit happening over here that is storing the information that you are, supplying it, but it's just updating based off of whatever the last thing you did was. So it looks like the last thing I did here was move primitive group number 70. So if I turn on my primitive numbers and zoom in here, you can see it's kind of small, but that primitive number is 70 right there. So it's just something to keep in mind. There's nothing wrong with working this way. It's just important to be mindful of the fact that, some of the things that you're doing over here will be affecting your network on this side, and it might be doing something that that wasn't quite intended. So it's just important to keep that stuff in mind. So let's just go back. I'm going to, the thing is, like, this edit node is totally non-destructive. Granted, you didn't do too much work in here and you didn't need to get back to some other step within here. You could, just move away from this node and select your grid and start all over again. Likewise, if you wanted to keep those edits that you did, I'm just going to hit undo until we get our old edit back, where we've got our groups here. Well, suppose you wanted to actually move that primitive, but you wanted to keep this edit as its own separate entity. All I would do is I would kind of throw down a null at that point. I don't know if there's a better way to do this, but if you throw down a null and select the null, then go back to your selection tool, select primitive, and now move this primitive, it's thrown down a new edit SOP for us. So now we can choose between these two edits that we made if you are wanting to have that level of control over your sort of modeling process. Now, this isn't the case for every single node, but it's just important to note that the edit SOP appears when you start to be pushing geometry around on your own over here. So right now, what I want to do is I want to kind of just take us through sort of the greatest hits of modeling, just sort of the typical things that at least I find to be super handy in any 3D application for modeling. So I'm just going to delete, I'm going to delete these and go back to the grid. And what I want to do is I want to just extrude a little circle out of the middle here, maybe bevel it, and then I'm going to curl it around in half and then sort of connect it to itself. You'll see. So let's do a cool trick here, which is we can actually select a bunch of points. So I'm going to hit my selection tool here, and I'm going to grab point selection mode. And then from here, I can actually do, there's a paint selection mode, which is what this icon is, brush select. And then if I middle mouse, scroll my middle mouse wheel up or down, you can see it's changing the size of that. So I'm just going to select a little loop of points in the middle here. You can see I've got those selected. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to invoke the edit by clicking the move tool and then doing nothing. So now we've got the edit node that has appeared there by just hitting this move tool. And then I'm going to hit Shift C. And that actually is going to circularize those points, which is super handy. Cool. So now I want to say I want to extrude this inner part right here. Well, you might be thinking to yourself, well, I can go over here and hit extrude. So I'm going to hit tab, type poly extrude down, and throw that into my network. And then if I were to grab this node and, adjust the distance, you'd see, it's extruding everything. Alternatively, if I go back to my edit, I could just go in here and let's go to laser pointer selection mode. And I'm going to select primitives. And if I just brush over these primitives, it has made a selection. Now, when I'm in this mode, if I hit the tab key and type poly extrude and hit enter, it throws down a node for us, not to be confused with this other one that we did on our own over here. It throws down this node for us, and it has this selection made for us of the polygons that we had previously selected before we invoked the tab menu to throw down our poly extrude. And it's got a little handle here, and I can just pull that up or down, somewhere, wherever it's good. So you can see that is a slightly different behavior when you're over here. It's good to note that if you're looking for a certain type of behavior, you might be able to find it by using your tab menu in the scene view as opposed to in your network view over here. Now, suppose I had made this poly extrusion and I wanted to, change what faces I was poly extruding, up here in the group selection area, there's this little arrow. And if I were to hit this arrow, I could then come over here and it brings me back to a previous state. And I could, for example, control click that middle face to deselect it and then hit enter. And it has removed that face from the group. Because control clicking will remove from a selection and shift clicking will add to the selection. Okay, I'm going to just add that polygon back into my group here by clicking the group selector, shift clicking, and hitting enter. And now we've gotten that polygon added to our group. Cool. So another thing that I typically like to do is maybe add a bevel. So I'm going to do a partial loop selection since there isn't really, even though this is a circle, it's not going to recognize this as a loop for us. Actually, if I actually did primitive selection though around these edges, it might. So let's try that. Let's go back to primitive selection mode. I'm just going to choose box selection right here. And if I click here and I hold down Shift A and middle mouse click, yeah, you can see that it has selected all of our primitives around that edge. You can tell, you can get certain tooltips down here at the bottom. I'm just sort of a cheat sheet. It says hold A, control A or Shift A to, let's go back to that. If I click away, click back, you can see it's giving me a little tooltip here to hold A, control A, Shift A, and to select full using the middle mouse button or partial edge loops. So that's one way that you can do that. I'm going to actually switch back to edge mode, and I'm going to click on this first one using Shift A and then clicking my middle mouse button, and it gets to a juncture where it doesn't realize what direction it should go to complete the loop, so it just stops. So I'm just going to do that for all of these edges around this top edge, and so that all those are selected. So now let's throw down a poly bevel. So a different way I can do this, I could hit the tab key and start typing in poly bevel, like like so, and then hit enter, and it would bevel those edges. Another one that another way that a lot of people like to work is using the radial menu, and I'll just do this one using the radial menu. So I'm going to hit C, and I get this menu that pops up. Now if I navigate up to Model, Polygons, over here you can see it's got polybevel. So I'll just click that, and it throws down a polybevel node for us. And over here, if I just crank up the fixed distance, we're good. And then I can change it to something round, so we get a nice rounded edge there. I can change my divisions, etc. Cool. So now at this point, what I might want to do is subdivide. So I'll throw down a subdivide node over here and pump that in there. And I want to get like a better crease down here. So what I'm going to do is going to hop back up to my polybevel. Now this is important to note. If I were over here and I were to say add an edge loop, it would add it after the subdivide. And I really want to make sure I know where I'm adding my. I want to add my my edge loop before the subdivide. So I've got to click on, if I have this object selected, this polybevel selected, when I go over here and type tab edge loop, it adds the node after the polybevel, not after the subdivide. So it's important to note that it'll do that. And you can see now that because I've added an edge loop while my using the tab menu from the scene view, it has created this poly split over here. You'll notice if I just add my edge loop like so, if I were to go over here and try to add an edge loop, it doesn't see edge loop in this menu. That's because edge loop is a function built in poly split, and it really is kind of dependent on you selecting your edge loop from your viewport. So one more time, I'm just going to go back over here to my polybevel and hit tab, and I'm going to type in edge loop so that we can see that how that's different again. So yeah, I've typed edge loop, it's created poly split over here, and I get this your typical edge loop tool. So I'll just add a little edge loop down here so we get sort of a nice edge when we go and subdivide. So when we subdivide, you can see that's looking pretty good. Cool. So next thing, what I want to do is let's add a bend, and let's bend this thing down. Let's bend this thing around in sort of like a half arc. So I'm just going to throw over here. I'm going to hit tab and type bend, and I'll wire that in. You can see I've got this sort of visual fall off as to where my bend's going to happen. I'll just keep my bend or capture origin at 0, and the capture direction I'll just keep in that direction. I'll just change the length to be something like, well, I think that this this piece of geo is 10 wide, so I'll make my capture length be 5. Cool. And then I'll go over here and I can, adjust my bend like so. Now I want this to bend like in both directions. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just copy this bend and wire that in here. And you can see it's doing a double bend at this point, but instead on this bend, what I want to do is I want to change the capture direction to go in the negative Z axis this time. And now if I go up to my second bend and I right click on the bend angle, and I say copy parameter, then I go up to this bend and I right click and click paste relative references. It takes over, this channel is taken over and is being driven now by the second bend. So all I have to do is go down here and grab the second bend and adjust it, and it's adjusting the value of the bend on the first one as well. Cool. Probably not entirely necessary for this example, but just a fun reminder of how handy these paste relative reference, copy relative reference workflow can be. So I'm going to just, let's grab these. I'm going to align those. And then the next thing I want to do is I want to, let's bridge these two edges together. So on my bends, I've got this visualizer that I don't want to see anymore. I'm just going to scroll up and untick visualize fall off so that that goes away. And okay, so now that we're over here, let's select our first edge. I'm going to select this, and then if I hold Shift A and then left mouse click here, you can see it's giving me a preview of the partial edge selection. So I've got that. Then I'm going to hit the C key, go up to Model, Polygons, and choose Poly Bridge. And now down here it's saying select the bridge destination polygons or edges and press enter to complete. So I will select over here. I'm just going to click with my left mouse button, holding Shift A, click again at the end with my left mouse button, and then click enter. And you can see it's thrown down a poly bridge over here. By default, it has this sort of arc to it. If I just grab these arrows and pull them back, it reduces that arc. You can see it affecting these magnitude parameters in our source and destination settings over here on the parameter view. Just going to drag this guy down, and you can see we get a nice flat bridge there. And then lastly, I just want to fill in these holes. So I'm going to throw down a poly cap. So if I go over here and type in poly cap, I could go over here and do another, edge loop selection on this geometry and then polycap these individually. But polyfill by default will just fill in anything that is open, that it sees as open. And it doesn't always get it right, but most of the time it gets it pretty right. So I'm going to wire this in here and turn the display flag on there, and you can see it's just made one gigantic n-gon. And you could change this from single polygon to triangles or triangle fan or quadrilateral fan, and it does its best to make quads out of that. Cool. And you can also see that it's got like this, by default, it's got the deform patch on, which just basically allows you to like puff this out if that's what you're after. I'm just going to turn it off, and here we go. We've got our log with a button on it, or whatever you want to call this. Maybe I'll throw down another subdivide just to see how it looks when it's all fully smoothed out. It's not looking terribly amazing around these edges, but for some pretty basic modeling, that's how the workflow goes when you want to traditionally model. So these all being kind of your more traditional steps as to going about how to model something, it gets kind of daunting as it just continues to build out this modifier stack type list of things that you've done to your geometry. And what becomes even more troublesome when you're working in this way is that if you were to go back to your original grid and say you decided you wanted to change your your resolution of the original grid, it's going to just destroy everything that you've done. Our circle is no longer centered. This thing is all messed up, and things change a lot depending on how the data is flowing through this procedural network, because we have a grid and originally only had 100 points or 100 squares. And now the edit is looking for groups that have been shifted around because the point counts have changed. So it's really important as you go along to be aware of where your topology is changing and how that is being affected by your graph down here, or by your graph down here, because it can yield some unexpected results if you're not careful. So I guess like the last thing that I would want to sort of demonstrate in this little section is how we can kind of start to think about getting around these types of issues. So I'm going to just go back to my grid. I'm going to keep all this here. I'm going to make my grid back to 10 by 10 so that this geometry is working over here. I'm just going to branch off to the, I'm just going to branch off over here. So suppose I just want to scale in these this top row of points. So what I could do is like we did before, I'll go back to my selection tool, and from this menu on the left, I'll pop out and select points. It's just another way of selecting from up here. I'm going to just drag over this top row of points, and I'm going to grab my scale tool and just scale them in a little bit. And you can see that it's thrown down an edit, and it's thrown it down in line with this previous edit. I don't really want that. I just want to branch off and start doing a different thing over here because we're just, experimenting. So I'm just going to shake this, and it's going to disconnect this node, and then I'll just wire it in separately. So now we've got our edit here. And like we were demonstrating before, if I change these rows and columns, it actually changes where these, pieces are, and everything gets all messed up. So what if there was a way that we could tell it, we want it to choose this top level of points no matter what? no matter what the resolution is. There is a way we can do that. So we can do that using groups. Now, if I go up here and suppose I were to, let's bring this back to 10 by 10, and I'm going to create a new group. So let's do that. I'm going to throw down a group node, and I'm going to wire this in. And by default, this group is looking for primitives. We actually want it to look for points. And it's going to grab all the points because by default, that's just what it does. It makes a group out of everything that's in. You can see that by this orange highlighted sets of points. So I'm going to disable the base group. So literally it's doing nothing. I'm going to rename this to top underscore row. And then I'm going to actually choose keep in bounding regions. Now this will allow us to create a bounding box where we want to store our group. So if I go over here and I select my manipulator tool for the group and I drag this up, these little faces, you can see they've got little arrows on them. You can just kind of drag them around. If I drag this up, so it's sort of profiling this this top row right here, I can drag these out. Whoops. I can drag it out like this. And there you can see that anything that's inside, any points that are inside of this box are now being grouped. So instead of doing an edit and using this manipulator like so, I could throw down a transform. So over here, I'm going to hit tab and type in transform and wire into the transform. Now, if I were to, scale in, it looks like X. I'm just going to hold down the middle mouse button and drag this in. We're scaling all of our geometry. It's because we haven't defined a group. So up here from the group, it sees that there is a top row group incoming. So on the transform, I can click this drop-down menu by our group and select top row. And here, it's only scaling this top row. So now when I scale these, you can see it's just adjusting the top row. And there's no group numbers here. I mean, we've got our point numbers here, but it's not. It honestly, all it cares about is things that are in this group. So I can now go back up to my grid and start changing the number of rows and columns. And as long as I don't have extra rows and columns starting to bleed into this top row group, it's going to respect that and keep only scaling in these points up here. So that's a real intro to sort of some of the standard modeling workflows in Houdini, and how we can start to think about using groups in a way to keep our modeling process procedural. So in the next section, we're actually going to dive a little bit deeper into groups and start exploring what all power there is in the almighty group. So I will catch you over there.